Parliament. All evidence is being recorded. You'll be provided with a proof of version of the transcript following the hearing. Transcript will be ultimately made public and posted on the committee website. For the hand setup records, can you please say your full name before we make your statement again, please? And just regarding your statement, can you just give them to a maximum of 8 minutes so we have plenty of time to discuss afterward? Okay, thank you. Please continue.
Thank you. Good to meet you all, and I would like to thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. I can see our document in front of some of you, so hopefully you've had a read of that and it kind of sets the scene and the context. And I would like to add a little more of a summary to that. Firstly, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today and pay my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal people who are here with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge the 30% of Victorians who rent their home. I think we often forget that, and that's what this inquiry is about. It's about 30% of Victorians who rent their home. And you've heard from some of them directly. I know that yesterday you had people in. And you're probably aware too that the demographics of renting are changing, that the numbers of renters are increasing in our community, and it's not just a transitional stage for lots of people, but it might be a housing tenure that people move in and out of throughout their life, or in fact they may remain renters for all of their life. So we need to keep in mind that the provision of safe, secure and affordable housing cannot just be seen through the lens of home ownership anymore. And we have a cultural perspective on housing that expects everybody to own their home at some point. Tenants Victoria was established in 1974 and has sought to advocate for and support the rights of renters since then, so we're almost 50 years old. We provide a lot of information, advice and support for people who rent their home. We also provide training and secondary consultation for other organisations who support renters. And of course, we participate in some of the public discussion, advocacy, as we're here today doing. We're staffed by a range of professionals, including those who undertake intake, lawyers, financial counselling, outreach workers to people who live in rooming houses, as well as increasingly multicultural renters who, as we discovered, are often overlooked, particularly those who live in the fringes of Melbourne. We welcome the reforms to Victoria's rental laws that we introduced in 2021. They're now in their third year of operation. And the intent of those laws was really to improve the rights of renters and provide a really good safety net for them. However, in Victoria, life as a renter remains insecure and difficult for many people because we have record low vacancy rates, we are seeing high rent increases, repairs still seem to be something that's negotiable, and often they're not undertaken or they take a long time. And VCAT, which is where people can go to have their disputes heard, is rife with delays and difficulties there. So in short, rental reform in this state is an unfinished business. And, we heard last week some of the national perspective on renting, and in many ways Victoria is in a better position than lots of other states and territories. However, we're not seeing that in practice for the people who come to us. They come to us seeking assistance often when they're in real trouble. We last year saw or helped over 8,000 people with more than 10,000 matters, and there were a further 1,100 matters that we assisted through a secondary consultation process. Repairs remains our biggest issue that people come to us with, also notices to vacate, and rent increases. And if you refer to pages 5 and 6 in our document, we give some examples there of some of the exorbitant rent increases that people have been. We did some rough calculations, and for our funding's about $3 million that comes from government, and there are about just short of 2 million renters in the state. So you can do the sums. It's not a big investment to provide this information, either in a more passive way on our website where people can come and help themselves, or more directly where we actually go through the VCAT process with people. Some of the examples that we hear of are heartbreaking. Occasionally I will listen to the phones, or I'll meet somebody in the foyer of our building who wants to come and see one of our staff. One of those recently was a guy who called us after he'd been without electricity for 9 weeks. His power board had stopped working, and he'd lived with it for a couple of weeks, and then contacted the real estate agent. He was told something would be done. A guy came out, had a look at it, said he would be back to fix it. He didn't come back to fix it. The guy continued to make contact with the agent and the landlord. After 9 weeks he ended up with a notice to vacate. This was a guy who'd been living in his home for 5 years. He was connected and established in that block of flats. He didn't want to move, but he also didn't want the trouble that this was going to cause for him to challenge this. So we were able to give him some advice, and he was happy to receive that. It's an ongoing thing, but these are the things that renters who we hear from regularly have to deal with. No power for 9 weeks. I mean, how do you cook? How do you wash? How do you see? I mean, just imagine it for yourself in your own home when there's a power blackout, and everybody, wants to know when the power's coming back on. This was something that was discrete to his property that needed to be fixed. This is the sort of thing that at Tenants Victoria we hear over and over again. We see housing as a human right and as an essential service, and there is a lot of regulation around essential services in this state and in this country, as there should be. And so we would like to see some more real regulation. At the moment, it's easy for landlords and real estate agents to just disregard the regulation that sits there because there's no real enforcement. And so the law's not doing what it needs to do. The other thing that we would... I'm almost done. We would really like some proper conversation about is what is a reasonable rent increase, because 30% or 50% or 80% is not a reasonable rent increase. They're limited to once every year, and that's a good thing, but without a limit on how much it can be increased, it's always going to be the renter who pays for the landlord to make their commitments. And during the pandemic, we learnt a lot of things about the renting system. Small interventions work, time-limited interventions work, and government policy drives action. So we had a rent reduction program that was in place, and there were over 75,000 rent reductions that were registered with Consumer Affairs. Of course, there could have been many more, but that actually demonstrates that government interventions do work. We think there are lots of quick options and so-called low-hanging fruit. We outlined some of them in our submission. Yes, we need more supply, we're not arguing with that, but for the renters who are experiencing day after day, week after week, insecure, unsafe and unaffordable housing, now is the time to act.
Thank you,
Thank
Jennifer.
you.
If I could, because there are quite a few questions our committee would like to ask you.
Yeah.
And hopefully during this question you can actually explain more.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
Ms. Page, would you like to start?
Anyone else on the panel want to?
I think that's
Oh, that's the
submission.
okay. Sure.
You could keep it to very short, because we've got about 4 minutes each. Thank you.
No problem. You mentioned under-resourcing. Can you just explain, with Tenants Victoria, how is funding, is it a tender process that you do receive, putting a tender to government, or do you feel as though having that support of an ongoing funding arrangement with government, and forgive my ignorance when it comes to how these processes work, do you feel as though that would see you being able to guarantee more support being offered to tenants?
So we have 3-year contracts that we're currently working through. And, this is a really long-term process. It's not something that you switch on and switch off. Our core business is day after day, week after week, year after year, and we're able to take the themes, the evidence from that high volume, long-term work and put it into practice. Some of the challenges are that it's time-consuming work. Everybody wants to tell their story. They want somebody sympathetic to listen to the problems that they're having, and we do tend to limit our phone calls, the initial phone call, to a 15 or 20 minutes. So, there are lots of ways that we can ensure that there's efficiency in the system that we have, but actually the demand is so great that we're doing the best we can with what we have.
Definitely. We heard from a lot of renters, particularly they don't feel like they have a lot of rights. And I really appreciate that one of your recommendations is to enshrine the right within the Human Rights Charter of that right to a home. Can you tell me practically what that might mean for accountability more towards the property owners and their accountability of enshrining those rights?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the rights that are put into, we're very lucky to have a charter in Victoria.
22.
What it really does is it holds government to account. So I guess in this case you would see the flow-on effect of increased accountability on government to make sure that people are housed, whether it is through the private market or through the public system. So I think it would have the knock-on effect of government really having obligation to, as Jen was saying before, that enforcement piece is really missing at the moment.
Definitely.
Via VCAT or via Consumer Affairs, and I think that would strengthen the arm of government. Yeah.
And if I've got time for one more, you mentioned that you've got 8,000 people who you help on 10,000 matters. That to me sounds like you're having ongoing issues with particular agents and landlords, that there's recurring issues for maybe a particular renter, and they may have a request for a repair. Is this something that you're experiencing, that there are...
Yeah, so we have, we always hope that we can help someone and solve their problem and they'll go away, but unfortunately that doesn't happen. And again, just to return to that enforcement point, but if you go to VCAT and you make an application and VCAT makes an order to do a repair, for example, if the landlord doesn't do that repair, you have to go back again. So there's a lot of those repeat cycles.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Michael now. If you'd like to ask a question, Michael. You have about 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for joining us and for your very fulsome submission as well. It's been quite interesting to read through. If I can just ask, you did mention that Victoria is ahead of most other states, but that there seems to be a real issue in actual application of the regulations and the enforcement. I know you've also called for better training for real estate agents. What sort of specific measures, though, in terms of the enforcement side of things, would we implement which would mean that the regulations that we have are actually adhered to and complied with?
Again, I'll hand that one to Amy.
So I think there's two parts, as I mentioned. So one is the VCAT piece and one is the Consumer Affairs piece. So at the moment with VCAT, delays are really contributing to, the phrase of justice delayed is justice denied. So part of the framework around getting, incentivising landlords to make repairs is a compensation part where renters can apply for compensation. Renters are waiting up to 2 years at the moment for compensation matters to be heard. So that really doesn't incentivise landlords to make repairs. And the other part, the consumer affairs side, consumer affairs, in our view, is taking a sort of educational approach to some of the ways that they apply their powers. They are very strong in enforcement around trust accounts and things like that. So they do use their teeth sometimes, but we're not seeing them follow up and use their powers to issue infringements, for example, where repeat breaches of the Act have been perpetrated.
Yeah, thank you. And in terms of, you also mentioned regulation for short-term rentals, and you used some examples from around the world. Do you have an opinion on what's a better approach, whether it's legislation, regulation, whether it's rate variations, other surcharges, what the best way to regulate that sector is?
Well, we call for regulation of the sector. We recognise, though, that regulating Airbnbs is not going to solve the housing crisis. Right through our narrative is that there's no one silver bullet solution to the issues of housing affordability, and obviously, as Jennifer mentioned, supply is key. However, there is certainly academic evidence that in certain areas, for example, metropolitan Melbourne in the city area and certain holiday locations, there is a major issue around availability for workers, etc. So we haven't formed a view on what form that regulation should take. We think that is, we don't want to usurp the powers of the legislators and the policymakers in that regard. But what we do recognise is that there needs to be an intervention alongside a range of other interventions. So the short stay accommodation, whilst a popular and perhaps a headline-grabbing move, is not going to solve the housing crisis, but we do need intervention because it's been the Wild West to some extent on that matter. So that is our position.
Thank you. And if I still have time, Chair?
Yeah, one quick bit. Yep.
Yep. You mentioned obviously as well the 8,000 to 10,000 cases that you deal with, or 8,000 people, 10,000 cases that you typically deal with in a year. How many staff do you have to do that?
Not enough. What have we got at the moment? I think we've got...
we have five lawyers and 3 part-time intake workers who provide information on the phones. So.
And a financial counsellor and an outreach worker who goes to rooming houses. So,
Sounds like a lot of work for those people.
yes, it's very busy. I think all up we have about 25 EFT of staff, and we're building our volunteer pool as well. But yeah, we're not a big organisation by any stretch of the imagination.
Can I add that an important aspect of our work beyond the direct client services is our very comprehensive website, which is like an encyclopedia of renting. And, we put a lot of resources into that, and we have dedicated staff working on that because for many people, a self-guided approach, and when we say many people, this is the, the more empowered renter, unfortunately. That's not everybody. And so the more empowered renter can access our website. And in the last financial year, 571,813 users came to our website. So that's a significant number. That's that gives you a bit of an imprint on the need. And can I add that on our contact page, we just did a little assessment before we came here, 80,000 people users came to our contact page in the last financial year, but we were only able to service.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Ivy, would you like to?
Sure. Hi, Ave here. Thank you for coming in today. I'd like to begin with, we've just heard mention about rent increases and the pressure that's having on renters in the community. Out of National Cabinet recently, we've heard an outcome that other states are going to be coming into line with where Victoria is at, where you can increase rents once per year but by unlimited amounts. In your view, is that in any way a meaningful change to address the issue of rental affordability in this country?
That's an interesting question. I think it's part of the equation. So to have something there once a year is an appropriate number of times that it can be, or appropriate frequency to which it can be increased. But to not, we would argue, to not have a cap on that is the missing piece of that puzzle. What's reasonable? We've been calling for a fairness formula because we understand that costs do go up. It's appropriate to have an increase, but what is reasonable? We're not. That's for, as Farah said, others to make that decision. But we think there needs to be some kind of formula so that people know when the rent increase comes, it won't be any more than X percent or X dollars.
Yes.
Farah was on the radio a couple of weeks ago and there was a caller who called in afterwards who is a landlord. He owns a number of properties and he was of the view that he said, I didn't know it was unlimited. I thought it was 5% and that's what I use as the basis for my increase. So, there is a standard probably out there that is considered a reasonable standard, and we don't say that all landlords are bad people or that they're all greedy but there is a proportion who do need to have that guidance provided to them, and we would argue that should be in the form of some regulation around what is a reasonable rent increase.
And can I add that our service has been tracking rent increases as noted in our submission since the 1st of July 2022. And this is just our service alone. We've been tracking rent increases from $30 a week to over $500 a week. And that has resulted in some cases in houses, particularly, some share houses breaking up. And of course, the other thing we note, as mentioned in our submission, is the creeping factor that it's not just people on Centrelink or, that group of people who are obviously of the highest need, but also people on middle incomes with good jobs and great rental histories that are facing the affordability issues right now. And, the distress we hear, not just from our clients, but from via our story portal around these issues is very real in the community.
Thank you. And so just to sort of distill, so the frequency of the increase there's good intention there, but without the limit on the actual by how much you can increase, it's not fit for purpose.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. McCracken?
Hello, thank you. You right if I use your first names, by the way?
Yeah.
Yep, cool. Okay. I'm interested in the experiences that you guys have had in assisting people with navigating consumer affairs and the whole renting process, because it seems to be unnecessarily difficult to navigate through, and you almost have to be a professional renter in order to negotiate the situation if there's a dispute or if there's any challenges that you might face. And I'm interested, I note that you have this recommendation of strengthening the capacity of consumer affairs to do enforcement work. What do you think that looks like? I know you touched on it with Michael a bit, but I want to drill down a bit on what you think that might look like and how it could be better strengthened.
Yeah. I'll pass over to Amy to take that question.
So Consumer Affairs already has a range of powers under the Act, but at the moment, I guess the policy direction they're taking is, as I said before, more of an educative process. So, obviously they've got their own website and they've got the phone line that rental providers and real estate agents can call up for advice. They're not taking the other part of their role that they could take up, which is the issuing of infringements,
But why do you think that is? From your perspective, of course.
I guess looking at other regulators, I guess maybe it's, and I'm just speaking a little bit outside of, but there is, I think, a tendency of regulators to see their role as more educative rather than enforcement. And I think that has its place, of course, and I think people need to be told, and especially, with the rental laws, the changes came into effect in 2021 and there is a bit of a learning curve. Yeah. But it's, 2 years now, and we would expect that people know the law and obey it, and I think there is definitely, the arm of Consumer Affairs should be strengthened to make sure that the rights are being enforced. Yeah.
Because I've had a look through the 2021 changes and they set minimum standards and all these sort of things, but I'm getting the feel from a lot of different people that these standards aren't necessarily enforced, and whether it's the capacity of Consumer Affairs to actually enforce those issues or whether it's a willingness. Do you have a view on that?
I don't think we'd just be speculating.
Yeah, okay.
So you'd need to talk to them about that.
Yeah.
But what we see is that in many cases the action is not taken. And as Amy said before, VCAT may make an order, the repairs aren't done, the renter has to go back to VCAT, and so that becomes the mechanism that people use, or they abandon it.
Well, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say really quickly as well, I guess the onus is on the renter to bring the challenge or the action. And people are not, hopefully they're not frequent flyers in this space, so they've got to navigate the system.
Exactly.
It is meant to be very user-friendly, but it's still a legal system that needs to be navigated. And then, with the power difference at the moment, the rent increases, the lack of vacancies, it doesn't really incentivise people to uphold their rights. They'd rather stay in the property and live with what they've got rather than agitate. We heard of the fellow before who didn't have power for 9 weeks and then he agitated and was asked to leave. So there's lots of the status of renters is still, I think, yeah.
One of the other parts that we've heard a few different comments. Can I keep going? Oh, sorry. Is about the ability to navigate the VCAT system, and that. So Consumer Affairs have this 3-step process of resolving a dispute, have a conversation or a discussion, written notice, and then go to VCAT. And it seems to me that that's the first two don't really bring a resolution to most of the issues. VCAT shouldn't be the last issue, the last way of resolving an issue, but it seems as though it is. And when that is the last port of call, but it seems to be the most common, as you say, there's a backlog of sometimes up to 2 years to resolve a dispute, which is just ridiculous. Any thoughts about resolving that issue so that whether it's VCAT that's not the last port of call or whether there might be some other step in there that we can take away some of that backlog?
Yeah, so I think VCAT has a resourcing issue probably.
Yeah.
But I think the other part as well, and one of the other recommendations we make is around an internal review at VCAT. So at the moment, if you get a decision that you disagree with or you think is wrong in law, your only avenue is to appeal it up to the Supreme Court. So that's a huge jump up from a no-cost, more relaxed jurisdiction up to the Supreme Court of Victoria, which is, you're exposing yourself to between $30,000 and $50,000 worth of costs if you were to lose. And because also in VCAT, the decisions aren't, they don't have to follow each other's decisions. There's lots of inconsistency with decision making. When you've got lack of clarity in the law, that means people are more likely to take a shot, just go and see what happens on the day in VCAT. I think if there was an internal review mechanism within VCAT and clarity of the law, it would be much clearer what your outcome would be, in particular in compensation claims, for example, and there wouldn't be a need to be like, let's roll the dice on the day and see which member we get. You would have a consistent understanding of the way the law would be applied, and I think that would promote better behaviour and better decision making.
Well, part of the challenge too is obviously if it costs $70 to go to VCAT and you're trying to get, $150 back on something, you've got to weigh it up and think, well, what's the point?
Yeah.
And maybe there needs to be a bar set as to what the standard might be. Okay, go to VCAT if it's over $500 and then you can deal with Consumer Affairs if it's something, I don't know. I'm just talking off the top of my head here, but reform in that area too I think is needed.
Again, if we can go back to what happened during the pandemic lockdowns, Consumer Affairs ran a front door negotiation and mediation process in order to get to the rent reduction, and we saw that it worked. It was an example of something that did work. It was away from VCAT. It sat before. People had to go through there in order to sort of get to the end point of VCAT. And it, from our point of view, it wasn't perfect, but it was an example of something that worked. And at the end of those lockdowns and those emergency measures, it stopped. And it's almost like we've forgotten it. We need to remember the things that we've done that have been successful and have helped people.
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mansfield.
Thank you, and thank you for your very detailed submission and for the work that you do for many in our community. I'm interested in unpacking the fairness formula a little bit more. You've proposed this as a measure to limit the amount rents can increase. Can you explain a bit more, the basis for that recommendation about a fairness formula and how it compares to, say, other proposals like pegging rent increases to CPI as one example?
I'll hand to Farah in a minute, but I think the phrase came out of an understanding that we are just one part of the system and that there is a larger system at play here. And so the fairness is for a fair system. It's not just one-sided, but it needs to encompass all parts of the system, and that's really what we were hoping would result, that there would be a discussion, possibly all parts of the system coming together and negotiating, well, what's fair? And that was where that came from. But Farah, do you want to add some more to that?
Well, we were deliberately not prescriptive. So the term fairness formula has as Jen explains, has a certain rationale. But we cite in our submission, the ACT model, which is pegged to the CPI plus 10. And, the fairness formula, as demonstrated in ACT, has not stopped, rent rises, etc. It stops the egregious rent rises we've seen. It has, so we haven't tried to dictate to the legislators or the policymakers and in fact people have challenged us on that, or can we have the actual mathematical calculation of the fairness formula? But we've deliberately not done so because we feel that it is an expression of the need to limit egregious rent increases. So it offers a guidance and a ceiling, and in the ACT we see that if it doesn't prohibit a landlord from acting if they can go to the tribunal if the renter objects. So it is actually not some kind of, it's a very modest market intervention that we're proposing. And to the point that the economists make about the price signal, we wouldn't recommend that it be tied, like if there's a new lease, a new rent can be negotiated. So that addresses the price signal point. I think that issue has been, if one was to refer to the submission from Professor Hal Pawson, an expert in housing from the University of New South Wales, they talk about that price signal argument around rent increases. Andrew Barr, the Chief Minister at the ACT, has made the point that it is to address the most egregious forms of rent increase. We also have minimum standards here in Victoria. So in a sense, another argument against such a measure is that, if they can't increase the rent, they won't address repairs. Aside from the issue of the broader issue of repairs we have in Victoria, we have minimum standards. So, they are mandated to, all rental properties must meet minimum standards. So the match-up of a fairness formula with minimum standards, we think and have argued can get a fair outcome, and it is really a very modest option in the range of options, including some that people on the other side have proposed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Bark?
Thanks. Thank you all for coming in, and great to see you again, Jennifer. Yesterday, Farah, we heard about mushrooms in bathrooms. So we take your point on repairs and fungus removal. I really liked some of your comments earlier, Amy, about VCAT, and I'd sort of jotted down justice delayed is justice denied. I might move a little bit later on that's the heading of one of our chapters because we've heard so much about VCAT and the appalling wait times often to get what seem like very minor matters settled, but matters that are for renters of great significance. We heard about, bond being weaponised. That was the expression of one of our panellists yesterday. Can I very quickly, because I know we're basically out of time, touch on something that you said earlier, Jennifer, that we haven't yet touched on in our questioning, and that's the matter of supply. I understand that that's not a key feature of your submission, but nonetheless you touch upon it. And we've heard sort of a range of potential ideas, a range of ideas in the sort of public discussion about supply. I have my worries about the sort of growing sprawl of Melbourne and pushing people further and further to the edges. Would you mind just touching upon some of your thoughts about where we should be thinking as we fashion some recommendations around supply?
So you're probably not going to like my answer because I'm not going to get bogged down in the issue of supply. We're not experts in supply. We are spread very thin about what we are experts in. We have enough work to do engaging in the rental system. So I think we leave it to those who know more than us about what the supply should consist of. We need more supply. We know that. There aren't enough houses for people. When people leave a property because they can't afford a rent, they are stepping into insecurity of housing. They don't know what comes next for them because there's not enough that is affordable. So I think, we need more supply. We need more social housing, that we're falling behind the benchmarks in other states and territories in this country. And what we're seeing is that there is no safety net for people who can't afford the rent increases in the private market, can't get the repairs done, they need to leave, and there's nothing else for them. So they do put themselves into a precarious situation with their housing, which is no good for anybody. It's no good for them contributing to life and our community. It's no good for the rest of us because we have these situations where people are really focused on survival rather than thriving. So we would encourage more supply, we would encourage more social housing, and we also would ask that something be done now for those people who are in really precarious situations, who can't wait for 1st of July next year when new supply is going to be started.
Well, for the record, I like that answer very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mark. Just be mindful of time, and we do have another witness coming up. But I do thank you for your attendance and your submissions. I think one submission actually gave some very good insight, especially I know you touched on conditions, vacants, and rent raise, and you actually gave a very good insight lesson to, I know you don't want to adversely affect the properties, also providing the advice lesson to the fairness or the reasonable increase in rent, including accompanying ways to CPI plus %, which balance on both sides. I think that's very, very important submission. I would again to take a few minutes of your time.
Thank you.
This brings the panel back to a close for this session. I'd just like to move on to the next session now, and I do thank you for your time and submission today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.